One of my favorite, and in my opinion, one of the most interesting stories in the history of heavy music is how metalcore went from the grimy streets of a pre-Giuliani New York to middle-class suburbs all across North America. From New York street kids to suburban scene kids. Scene kids who had very little, if any, idea of the history of the music they were listening to and making, where it came from, how it came to be, who started it. Hell, even today, I would say that most of those former scene kids don't know its full history. But regardless of that, those scene kids completely changed the future of not only heavy music, but they also completely revolutionized how bands and artists operate in this new digital age. So, today, I wanted to go over the history of metalcore and how all of this happened and how it wound up changing heavy music forever. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video, so grab a monster, break out those old skinny jeans, and enjoy the video. But first, this video is brought to you by this lady here. If you want to help me buy her treats and toys, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Or if you're feeling generous, you can donate or tip over on Ko-Fi, however it's pronounced. On to today's video. Part 1, New York Hardcore. So in order to explain the development and rise of metalcore, we first need to establish the New York hardcore scene that it arose from. Personally, New York hardcore is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, hardcore scenes. Part of it's that certain musical elements and attitudes within the music are more appealing to me, but part of it is also that I love certain styles for the era or scene they came from. I know I've railed against vibes in music before, but I do think there is something about the vibes that certain music can bring you, specifically when that music evokes images or feelings of a certain time or place. And in this case, it's the dirty streets of a New York long gone. Maybe it's because I grew up playing GTA 4 or because Batman was a childhood favorite of mine, but there's something weirdly nostalgic about this era of New York for me, even though I've never been further east in that time I slept in a truck stop in South Park. But that's enough of that. Let's get on to the story of New York hardcore. I'm going to assume that most of you are already at least broadly familiar with the beginnings of hardcore punk. In the early 80s, DC bands like Minor Threat, Youth Brigade, and Bad Brains took punk rock in a more aggressive and less musical direction. Yada yada yada. I'm sure you've heard the story before. The early New York hardcore scene wasn't drastically different than hardcore in other places, but by the mid-'80s, it had begun to really differentiate itself in a few notable ways. For starters, New York in the 80s was a rough place. This was not the New York that Taylor Swift sung about, and these were not upper-middle-class kids like Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat. These were New York street kids growing up in or around dangerous and violent neighborhoods in a decaying city, and the music reflected that. New York hardcore also came up at the same time and place as hip-hop, and that's evident in much of the music. New York hardcore bands were among the first to introduce and popularize street fashion imagery that so many bands still use to this day. The other important element is spirituality and a search for something higher. It's hard to track down exactly why and how the New York scene became more interested in theological and metaphysical concepts than other places, but Bad Brains, who migrated from DC to New York early on, may have played a role as they were Rastafarians. And later on, Hare Krishna, which was a sort of new age spiritual movement that started in the 1960s, had some followers in the New York hardcore scene, and some so-called Krishnacore bands popped up in the mid to late 80s. Bands like Shelter and 108. I believe it's this that helped lay the foundations for all of the Christian metalcore bands that would thrive in a couple decades to come. The last, and most important element, is metal. New York hardcore bands weren't the first or the only to start incorporating metal influences, but it quickly became a defining element of the scene. Bands like Agnostic Front, Cro-Mags, and the Stormtroopers of Death brought in blast beats, tighter guitars, and palm-muted chugs to the sound. Crossover thrash thrived in and around New York City. Now, it's important to note that at the time, metal and hardcore were not cool with each other. Namely, hardcore kids really didn't like metal dudes. And frankly, I don't blame them. Metal dudes are kind of the worst. But regardless of that, throughout the 80s, metal and hardcore did have an off and on again, albeit toxic relationship, with thrash metal drawing from the aggression and speed of hardcore, and in turn, hardcore bands particularly in New York, began to play a thrashy hardcore that became known as crossover. You could maybe call this stuff a sort of proto-metalcore. Black metal obviously draws from the raw and stripped-down production of hardcore, and a lot of the DIY attitudes and ethos. Grindcore took the burgeoning sounds of extreme metal and fused them with hardcore and crust punk. And one of my favorite genres, sludge, began when hardcore bands started getting really into Black Sabbath, with Side B of Black Flag's My War EP being a landmark release in the genre. All this to say that as much as metal dudes love to turn their heads up at hardcore and dismiss genres like metalcore as not real metal, metal actually owes a lot to hardcore. In fact, I would go as far as to argue that without hardcore, we wouldn't really have any of the non-cheesy metal genres. We'd be stuck with European dudes singing about dragons and shit. Metal dudes, however, kind of just love to arbitrarily pick and choose what hardcore influences are acceptable or not. But anyways, back to New York hardcore. While bands like Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags were paving ground with this more metallic-sounding hardcore, there was another scene that popped up in New York around the same time. The youth crew bands. Made up of bands like Youth of Today, Gorilla Biscuits, and Judge. The youth crew separated itself from other New York hardcore bands in a couple of ways. Number one, they rejected the metallic influences and opted for a more traditional hardcore sound. Two, they took New York hardcore in a more positive direction. These bands were among the first to really take the straight edge label that Ian MacKaye had coined in the early 80s and turn it into an actual movement, alongside veganism, which is where straight edge began to be associated with veganism. And their lyrics were focused more on well-being, personal growth, and strength. The other way they differentiated themselves is many of the youth crew came from the suburbs around New York City rather than the city itself. And along with it, they brought clean-cut suburban fashion. Leather vests and bandanas were traded in for varsity jackets and bleach blonde hair. Something completely alien to hardcore at the time. It's worth remembering that at the time, hardcore and punk were largely big city things, but these youth crew bands helped to establish suburbia in the punk world. The movement flourished from the mid to late 80s, but by the 90s it burned out. But its legacy would live on in hardcore in various ways, including in metalcore. It's from the ashes of the youth crew movement that we would get some of the earliest metallic hardcore outfits of the 90s. Along with the vegan straight-edge themes that many of those early metallic hardcore bands would espouse. Part 2. Metallic Hardcore. So now that we've established the backstory of New York hardcore, we're going to go over the origins of metalcore. Figuring out who the first metalcore band was is a bit of a nebulous task. The evolution of genres and styles often mirrors that of the evolution of species in real life, or maybe a more apt comparison would be the evolution of languages. When did the Middle English of Chaucer become the modern English of Shakespeare? It's all sort of a gradual change, and we just have to sort of draw a line somewhere. But there are a few specific bands I think we can point to as having played a role in the development of metalcore. The first of these bands actually being from outside of New York. Hardcore scenes throughout the Northeast, and even into parts of the Midwest, were heavily influenced by the New York hardcore sound. And it's from Cleveland that we get what some consider to be the first metalcore band, Integrity. Formed in 1998, they would release a demo the following year called Harder They Fall. The album is still very punky, but they're definitely turning up that metal dial. Their debut album, Those Who Fear Tomorrow, from 1991, continued the progression with tighter production and chunkier guitars. But still, it's not quite the metalcore that everyone knows and loves now. If we head back to New York, though upstate, we'll find a name that almost everyone cites as being the first metalcore band, Earth Crisis. They released their first EP, All Out War, in 1992, but it was their second EP, Firestorm, which really solidified themselves as early metalcore juggernauts. They continued to increase the metal dial with their second EP, featuring really tight production that at the time was really only found in metal. And the titular track also featured apocalyptic lyrics about killing drug dealers, which I think we might need to explain a little bit. Earth Crisis were a part of, or at least associated with, a very interesting movement in hardcore, that being Hardline. Hardline was a militant, straight-edge vegan movement started by Sean Mutaki of Vegan Right. For what it's worth, Earth Crisis deny ever having been a part of the Hardline movement, but they did share many of the same views and beliefs, and they did come up at the same time. Hardline rejected not only drugs and alcohol, and promoted veganism and animal liberation, but it also shied away from third world crops like coffee and chocolate. Many of these bands were also pro-life and often anti-gay. This was all under a quote-unquote militant ethos that encouraged violence. This is really where the stereotype of straight-edge kids being violent originated from. Now, based on some of these beliefs, I think it's easy to call these bands conservative, but I don't really think their views sit neatly on a modern left-right political axis, especially looking back over 30 years later. I bring this up not only to contextualize where these bands were coming from, but also to say that contrary to what you might hear on punk or hardcore subreddits, these genres never had a cohesive or coherent political ideology, let alone one that just so happens to align with r/hardcore's idea of left-wing politics. Punk and hardcore have always had a wide spectrum of eclectic political beliefs, most of which were frankly nonsensical or not worth taking seriously. That's all I'm going to say in regards to politics, though. Just wanted to clarify that little bit of historical revisionism that I see a lot these days. Another band within that militant, vegan, straight-edge metalcore world that I think is worth noting is Abnegation from Pennsylvania.
Cries of the helpless. They haunt my mind. And in defense of the innocent, I'm prepared to die!
What's really interesting about them is they started out as a metalcore act, but over time transitioned into more of a brutal death metal act. The result is that there was sort of an in-between period in the mid-90s where they were sort of a proto-deathcore act, while metalcore itself was still in its infancy. Also worth noting at the time are all of the beatdown or tough guy hardcore bands that were popping off in the city at the time. Bands like Madball, Marauder, Irate, and Bulldoze.
I'ma see just how far we shove this underground shit, your ass, bitch. I'll step up, you coward, fucking criminal. They're supposed to be right up.
Whether or not these bands are metalcore is somewhat debatable, but they still help to push forward that metallic sound throughout the 90s. The next band I want to note here isn't from New York, or anywhere from the Northeast, or even from North America for that matter. Far over the waters in Belgium, a hardcore scene was brewing in the mid to late 90s that was heavily influenced by the metalcore scene coming out of the Northeast, that being the Hate Thousand scene. The standout band here, I think, being Congress, as they were really the pioneers of the scene. But I encourage all of you who like metalcore to go check out the Hate Thousand scene. The Hate Thousand scene was really interesting for not only being among the first metalcore bands outside of North America, but they were the first to really blur the lines between metal and hardcore. Bands like Abnegation, Earth Crisis, and Integrity were very much hardcore bands with metal influences, but bands like Congress sounded more like metal bands with hardcore influences, hence why it's often called edge metal. These bands would also lay some groundwork for deathcore, with bands like Deformity bringing in tremolo picking and gutturals. Throughout the 90s, metalcore would continue to slowly but steadily grow, with different scenes popping up in different places. Labels like Solid State, Victory Records, and Equal Vision helped to distribute these bands around the world through the decade and get more and more recognition in the world of heavy music. Which leads me to the next band that I want to note, that being Texas death metal band embodiment. Who, after being signed to Solid State in the mid-90s, began incorporating some metalcore influences from their label mates. And with their debut album, Embrace the Eternal, in 1998, they would establish deathcore as a genre. Then they would go on to become a Christian hard rock band. Weird trajectory, but those albums are honestly really good too. Now, the last scene in bands I want to point out is one that has been overlooked by most of us for years, including myself. That being the late 90s Boston metalcore scene and some of the surrounding areas. Bands like Aftershock, Overcast, Shadows Fall, and Blood Has Been Shed. These bands were the first ones to bring in the at the gates riffs that would dominate metalcore in the coming decade, along with the clean vocals and clean guitar parts, and they too would continue to blur the line between metal and hardcore. Now, most of you probably don't recognize any of those names, but you most certainly recognize the people in those bands and the bands that they would form in just a few years' time. For example, Adam Dukowitz and Joe Strutzel from Aftershock and Mike D'Antonio from Overcast would go on to form Killswitch Engage. Phil Labonte from Shadows Fall would form All That Remains. They, along with many other metalcore and deathcore acts from that area, such as The Red Chord, Hatebreed, Converge, and more, were the first metalcore bands to really blow up in the early to mid-2000s and defined metalcore for the next decade to come. I really don't know how or why so many of us, myself included, have been overlooking this scene so much. They were the first metalcore acts to actually get popular, and yet whenever the question, where did metalcore come from, gets asked, these bands rarely get mentioned. Sure, metalcore got its start in New York, but it's in and around Massachusetts that we get the metalcore that we all know and love today. The metalcore that would come to define the MySpace era. Speaking of MySpace, let's now talk about Scene Kids and how they came to inherit metalcore.
Lila Strogoff takes a closer look in this Fox 11 Undercover report.
The sound is intense. The look distinctive.
Hair that covers one part of their eye.
The feeling dark and angry.
Anger, rage, heartache.
These are emo Scene Kids, but if you're over 25, you've probably never heard of them.
Scene Kids. You definitely emo Scene Kids.
They trace their roots from early punk rock to goth to emo, short for emotional hardcore. When emo started spreading on the internet, it just exploded.
Alright, so originally there was going to be a segment in this part of the video where I did some detective work and try to work out the origin of Scene, specifically the name and where it first began to be used. However, that segment wound up being far too long for this video. It's currently sitting at about 15 minutes. So instead, I'm turning that into its own video, which should be out within a few days to a week after this video. Or, if you're watching in the near future, it's already out now, and you can watch it here. Otherwise, back to the video. So going into this video, I think I had a pretty general idea of the history of metalcore and scene culture, but I wanted to make sure that I had the right ideas. And after doing some research, I think I have a pretty good idea how metalcore wound up being adopted by scene kids. The key being what I'm going to call the missing link bands. That being bands like 18 Visions, Under Oath, and Hawthorne Heights. These bands emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s, bringing in a fusion of metalcore, post-hardcore, and screamo. Now, these bands aren't as popular and are not brought up as often these days, but I think they were definitely the starting point for early scene culture and the sort of catalyst as to how metalcore would switch scenes. Bands like 18 Visions also pioneered what was known as fashioncore, which undoubtedly left its mark on scene culture, especially the fashion. And a couple years later, Killswitch would blow up after bringing in Howard, pairing Howard's operatic, yet catchy, clean vocals with the melodic death metal riffs propelled metalcore into the mainstream.
This distance
popularizing not just metalcore, but a lot of adjacent or similar sounding bands like Lamb of God or Bullet for My Valentine, and even bands like Children of Bodom. And, of course, you can't mention Scene Kids without talking about MySpace.
Oh my god, Liz, who's talking to me? Oh my god. Not nasty. Well, she is nasty.
The social media site, which came out in 2003, was quickly embraced by both this up-and-coming scene culture and a lot of the post-hardcore, screamo, and metalcore bands. Which is sort of funny to think about because rock, metal, and hardcore culture today is so antiquated and behind the times, it's hard to imagine a time when heavy bands were the ones pioneering new ground on social media and capturing the attention of the youth. But that aside, this is where the transformation was complete. By 2005, metalcore was firmly in the hands of scene kids, and the first wave of scene, metalcore, and deathcore bands were forming on places like MySpace. Now, the earliest scene kids were probably a little more aware of the background and history of these styles, but because scene grew so astronomically fast, each subsequent wave of scene kid had an increasingly superficial level of knowledge on the music. Now, in heavy music, that's generally considered to be a bad thing. Heavy music is overburdened with these ideas that you need to have an encyclopedic knowledge and know all of these obscure bands, otherwise you're just a poser or a tourist. But I think that's what made the MySpace era so great. Scene kids didn't know much or really care about any of the history. They were just having fun with this cool new music and breaking all the rules. Because for as much as heavy music loves to pretend that it's all about breaking the rules and doing things your way and being unique, none of that's really true. Rock, metal, hardcore, and punk are easily the most rules-based, rigid genres out there, with strict ideas on how to dress, act, talk, what you can listen to, what counts as real X or real Y. But scene kids didn't know or care about any of these supposed rules. And because all of this was happening on these newfangled sites like MySpace, YouTube, and LiveJournal, the old heads, gatekeepers, and tastemakers had lost control. All they could do was write angry posts on their dying metal forums. Meanwhile, scene kids were writing disgustingly heavy deathcore tracks while wearing their little sister's clothes. Or adding synth sections to breakdowns. Or mixing crunk and hyphy rap with screamo and metalcore. All wrapped up in this flamboyant and loud fashion. And this is why you had, 15-year-old suburban girls listening to bands like Suicide Silence, which, by the way, is important. Young women are the main drivers of culture. And while scene died out by 2010, their impact is still felt to this day. Scene kids and bands pioneered social media and laid the foundations for how artists use social media to this very day. And, for better or for worse, modern heavy music is pretty much all metalcore. The sound of modern mainstream metal has its DNA rooted in MySpace-era metalcore. Even in hardcore, most of the newer bands are also just metalcore, but in the more traditional sense. And sure, while I've lamented on how modern metal is too technical, too overproduced, and has become a bit stagnant, and metalcore is partly to blame for that, at the end of the day, scene kids won. The tastemakers, gatekeepers, and angry metal dorks posting on forums were just left behind. And after spending a few weeks working on these videos, I can't help but think that heavy music is long overdue for another big movement. Scene kids and MySpace were the last actual new movement in heavy music. So I can't help but wonder and hope that another one might be on the horizon. So that's it for today's video, and as always, you can follow me on Instagram, listen to my demos on SoundCloud, donate over on Ko-fi, and I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below. And make sure to check out the second part of this video when it's out here in the next few days to a week.